Every empire that ever fell made a purchase it couldn't afford. Not a quiet transaction buried in ledgers, a loud, visible, catastrophic bet, paid for with borrowed money, debased currency, or the future itself. And the pattern is always the same. The purchase looks like strength. It feels like destiny, but in hindsight, it was the receipt for collapse. These are 5 purchases that broke 5 empires. And if you understand why they failed, you will see the same logic operating in the world right now. Welcome to the financial system. Control the money, control the history. And remember, simple is never easy. The first purchase was made of marble, gold leaf, and stolen land. In the year 64 AD, a fire swept through Rome, destroying entire districts of the city. While thousands were left homeless, Emperor Nero saw opportunity. He seized over 300 acres of prime land in the heart of Rome and began constructing the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It was not a palace. It was a private city, a rotating dining room, walls encrusted with gemstones, ceilings that rained perfume on guests, an artificial lake surrounded by landscaped estates. One ancient historian wrote that the vestibule alone was large enough to contain a 120-foot statue of Nero himself. But here's the question no one at the time dared to ask. How do you pay for a palace when the empire is already running a deficit? Nero found the answer. He debased the currency. He gathered silver denarii, melted them down, mixed in cheap base metals, and reminted them with less silver content. Suddenly, he had more coins to spend. The Golden House was built, and it looked like power. But every subsequent emperor saw how easy the trick was. If you needed to fund a war, just add more copper. If you needed a new monument, debase a little more. Over the next 2 centuries, the denarius went from nearly pure silver to barely 5%. Nero's palace wasn't just a building, it was the prototype for currency destruction, the purchase that taught Rome how to cheat its own money. And when the money died, the empire followed. The second purchase was a fleet, the largest the world had ever seen. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain assembled 130 warships, 8,000 sailors, and 18,000 soldiers into what he called the Invincible Armada. Its mission, crush Protestant England and restore Catholic dominance over Europe. The cost was staggering, the equivalent of billions in today's money. And Spain didn't have it. The crown borrowed against silver shipments that hadn't yet crossed the Atlantic. German banking families like the Fuggers and Genoese financiers advanced enormous loans, secured by the promise of treasure from Potosi and Zacatecas. It was the 16th century version of maxing out your credit card to buy a weapon you can't afford to lose, and Spain lost. Storms, English fire ships, and poor strategy destroyed the Armada. Only half the fleet limped home. The financial shock was devastating. Spain had already declared bankruptcy in 1557 and 1575. After the Armada, it defaulted again in 1596. The richest empire on earth, sitting on more silver than any kingdom in history, was declaring bankruptcy every 2 decades because it kept buying wars it couldn't win with money it didn't have. The Armada wasn't just a military defeat, it was a sovereign credit event disguised as a naval battle. Spain never recovered. The third purchase was even more ironic. France bought another country's freedom and lost its own. In the 1770s, King Louis XVI saw a chance for revenge against Britain. The American colonies were rebelling, and France poured money into their cause: ships, soldiers, weapons, and loans. By the early 1780s, the French crown had borrowed more than 1 billion livres to fund the American Revolution. Debt service alone consumed over half of royal revenue. Imagine running a household where more than 50% of your income goes straight to paying interest and you're still borrowing more. That was France. Meanwhile, Versailles glittered with gold while ordinary people bore the weight. The tax system exempted the richest classes, the nobility and clergy, from direct taxation. The Third Estate, more than 90% of the country, paid land taxes, salt taxes, church tithes, and feudal dues. Bread consumed up to 70% of a worker's daily wages. When grain harvests failed in the late 1780s, prices doubled. Riots broke out in Paris over bread long before the storming of the Bastille. Within a decade of purchasing America's independence, France was bankrupt. The king summoned the Estates General for the first time in 150 years. It opened the floodgates of revolution. The guillotine was not forged in iron. It was forged in the ledgers of a purchase France could never afford. The fourth purchase was quieter, but just as fatal. In the 1850s, the Ottoman Empire looked around and saw that Europe had industrialized while it had stagnated. The solution seemed obvious. Modernize, buy European technology, build railroads, equip a modern army, construct palaces that could rival anything in Paris or London. And the Ottomans did all of it on credit. From the 1850s through the 1870s, the empire borrowed heavily from European banks at punishing interest rates. The same European powers the Ottomans once dominated now controlled their finances. Debt spiraled. Payments fell behind. And in 1881, the unthinkable happened. The empire was forced to hand control of its own treasury to an international commission run by France and Britain. Think about that for a moment. A 600-year-old empire, one that had once terrified Europe, that had conquered Constantinople, that had besieged Vienna, signed away its financial sovereignty because it couldn't pay its bills. The Ottomans didn't purchase modernity. They purchased dependency. Every railroad and palace came with a chain attached, and those chains led straight to the banks of London and Paris. By the time the empire finally collapsed after World War I, it had been financially dead for decades. The fifth purchase is the one that should haunt you, because it's the one that echoes loudest today. In 1875, British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli made one of the most celebrated deals in imperial history. Egypt's ruler, the Khedive Ismail, was drowning in debt and needed cash desperately. He offered to sell his shares in the Suez Canal, the most strategic waterway on Earth, the artery connecting Britain to India. Disraeli moved fast. He borrowed £4 million from the Rothschilds and bought the shares before Parliament even voted on it. It was hailed as a masterstroke. Britain now controlled the gateway to its empire. For 80 years, the Suez Canal was a symbol of British power. Then, in 1956, Egypt's new president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized it. Britain, along with France and Israel, launched a military invasion to take it back. The operation was actually succeeding. British forces were advancing. But Britain had forgotten something crucial. It was no longer the world's banker. America was. And America was furious. President Eisenhower threatened to dump every British pound the United States held, to block Britain's emergency loan from the IMF, to collapse the pound and watch Britain's economy burn. The British had no choice. They withdrew. In 11 days, a century of imperial power was exposed as an illusion. The purchase that had been celebrated as the crown jewel of empire became the instrument of its humiliation. Britain had bought the canal to protect an empire it could no longer afford, and when it tried to defend that purchase, its own creditor pulled the plug. 5 purchases, 5 empires, and one pattern that never changes. Nero's palace, Philip's Armada, Louis's revolution, the Ottomans' loans, and Disraeli's canal. Each one looked like power at the moment of signing. Each one was celebrated by courtiers, newspapers, and crowds. And each one concealed the same fatal arithmetic, spending beyond what the system could bear, borrowing against a future that would never arrive, and confusing the appearance of strength with actual solvency. The empires didn't fall because of the purchases alone. They fell because the purchases revealed what was already rotting underneath. Debt that couldn't be repaid, currencies that were losing trust, and leaders who chose spectacle over survival. And this is why the pattern matters now. Today, Governments borrow trillions as if it were nothing. Central banks create money with keystrokes. Nations purchase military operations, stimulus packages, and geopolitical influence with borrowed money backed by nothing but faith. The mechanism is identical, the scale is larger, and the reckoning, when it comes, will be faster. Because what took Rome 2 centuries, we can now accomplish in a decade. The lesson is brutal but clear. Every empire believes its purchases are investments, that this war will be the last one, that this palace will inspire loyalty, that this canal will secure the future. But treasuries don't lie, and history doesn't forgive. The receipt always comes due. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. Its financial system and history leaves clues. I show you where the money leads.